the breakthrough never came. By March 1944, the situation in Tokyo had evolved from frustrating to catastrophic. What began as an analytical puzzle had metastasized into strategic paralysis. Commander Kurihara's team worked 18-hour shifts in the windowless basement of the ADA facility, their faces illuminated by oscilloscope screens and stacks of failed transcriptions. The recordings played on loop. Moasi, Dibe, Neshchi, Tsa. The sounds became oppressive, meaningless syllables that seemed to mock their expertise. Analysts wore headphones until their ears ached, slowing playback speeds to quarter time, hunting for hidden English words beneath the strange phonetics. Nothing emerged. Just the same incomprehensible patterns, repeated across hundreds of intercepted transmissions. Lieutenant Yamada had stopped sleeping. His desk was buried under frequency analysis charts, statistical breakdowns, comparative linguistic studies. He'd ordered files on every indigenous language in the Pacific Theater: Tagalog, Visayan, Ilocano, dozens of Chinese dialects, Polynesian variants. None matched. The phonetic inventory alone defied categorization. Sounds that seemed to explode from the throat, tonal variations that changed meaning in ways no European language employed, consonant clusters that his Japanese-trained ear simply couldn't distinguish. The desperation grew tactical. Marine operations now moved with frightening coordination. Artillery barrages, naval bombardments, airstrikes, all synchronized through these mysterious transmissions. Japanese forces found themselves reacting, rather than anticipating, always one step behind. The intelligence advantage they'd enjoyed since Pearl Harbor had evaporated. "We're fighting an enemy whose intentions we cannot see," Kurihara reported to Naval General Staff in early April. "Every analytical method has failed. Frequency analysis shows no patterns. Statistical distribution suggests natural language, not cipher substitution. Timing analysis confirms military protocols, but linguistic identification remains impossible." Before we continue, click that subscribe button, like this video, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It brings me great joy knowing that these war stories and lessons get to people all over the world. Your support helps us bring more thrilling war stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's get back to the story. The facility brought in reinforcements. Professor Takashi Hayashi from Tokyo Imperial University, specialists in obscure Asian languages, even an anthropologist who'd studied Pacific Island cultures for 2 decades. They listened to the recordings with fresh ears, and reached the same conclusion as everyone before them: unknown, undecipherable, unbreakable. By mid-1944, the ADA facility had intercepted over 8,000 Navajo transmissions. They'd filled entire rooms with wax cylinders, annotated maps tracking transmission origins, compiled volumes of statistical analyses. The evidence was overwhelming. This wasn't random encryption or machine-generated code. This was structured human communication, operating under rules no Japanese analyst could penetrate. What terrified Kurihara most wasn't the mystery itself. It was the growing realization that they might never solve it. Japan had built its Pacific strategy on intelligence superiority, on knowing Allied movements before they happened. Now, across every contested island from the Solomons to the Marshalls, that advantage had vanished. The Americans had deployed something unprecedented, a code that didn't just resist breaking, it resisted even basic comprehension. And with every passing week, as marine offensives pushed deeper into Japanese-held territory, those incomprehensible transmissions multiplied. The walls of the ADA facility seemed to close in tighter each day, the weight of failure suffocating. Somewhere in the Pacific, Marines were speaking freely, coordinating complex operations in real time, utterly confident their communications were secure. They were right. The answer to Japan's cryptographic nightmare had existed for centuries, hidden in plain sight across 27,000 square miles of American Southwest desert. Diné-Bizard, the Navajo language, had evolved in isolation, shaped by geography, culture, and time, into something linguistically extraordinary. While Japanese cryptographers searched their archives for matches, they were looking in entirely the wrong direction. Navajo bore no relationship to any language in their databases. It wasn't Indo-European, not Sino-Tibetan, not Austronesian. It belonged to the Athabascan family, a linguistic island with roots stretching back over 1,000 years. The phonetic structure alone made it cryptographically impenetrable. 4 distinct tones, high, low, rising, falling, could transform identical consonant-vowel combinations into completely different words. Ta with a high tone meant 3. Ta with a low tone meant just. The difference was barely perceptible to untrained ears, yet altered meaning entirely. Japanese speakers, whose language employed no tonal variation whatsoever, couldn't reliably distinguish these shifts, even when listening repeatedly. Then came the sounds themselves. Ejective consonants produced by closing the glottis and releasing compressed air, t, k, ch, existed nowhere in Japanese phonology. The voiceless lateral fricative, transcribed as wayu, sounded like wind forced between tongue and teeth. Glottalized sonorants added another layer, mum and num, lu, sounds that required vocal cord manipulation Japanese speakers had never trained to produce or perceive. The grammar was equally formidable. Navajo was fundamentally verb-centered, with action words carrying the weight of entire English sentences. A single verb could incorporate subject, object, tense, mood, and aspect through prefix combinations. The verb to carry had separate forms depending on what was being carried. Something flat, something in a container, something animate, something granular. The possible combinations numbered in the millions. No declension tables could crack this. No frequency analysis could reveal patterns in a language where context shifted meaning at every turn. Philip Johnston recognized this fortress for exactly what it was: unbreakable. Born on the Navajo reservation in 1892, Johnston had grown up immersed in the language, while other white children learned nursery rhymes. By age 9, he was fluent, one of perhaps 20 non-Navajos worldwide who could make that claim. He'd seen firsthand how the language's complexity baffled outsiders, how even educated linguists struggled to grasp its fundamental logic. In January 1942, reading about the military's experiments with Native American languages, Johnston saw the connection others had missed. The Choctaw had served as impromptu communicators in World War I, but that effort was crude, unstructured, limited. Navajo offered something far more powerful: inherent encryption layered into every syllable. The language wasn't just difficult, it was specifically difficult in ways that defeated conventional cryptanalysis. No alphabet to substitute, no consistent word order to parse, no phonetic relationship to any major world language, and critically, almost zero speakers outside the Navajo Nation itself. In 1940, fewer than 30 non-Navajos could speak it fluently. Japan had no Navajo speakers, no Navajo dictionaries, no linguistic framework to even begin analysis. Johnston drafted his proposal in February 1942, formalize Navajo as a military code, recruit native speakers, add tactical vocabulary, create an encryption system within an already impenetrable language. A code built not on mathematics, but on culture, on centuries of linguistic evolution that had accidentally produced the perfect cryptographic weapon. He requested a meeting with Major General Clayton Vogel at Camp Elliott. The demonstration would change the Pacific War. On May 4, 1942, 29 Navajo recruits entered a locked building at Camp Elliott and began constructing something that had never existed before, a double-encrypted military communication system that fused ancient language with modern warfare. The challenge was immense. Navajo had no words for tanks, submarines, aircraft carriers, or dive bombers. The language had evolved around sheep herding, weaving, and high desert survival, not mechanized combat. These 29 men had to bridge millennia in 8 weeks, creating military terminology from scratch, while ensuring every word remained memorable, logical, and resistant to outside decryption. They worked through cultural metaphor, building vocabulary that made intuitive sense to Navajo speakers, but would remain incomprehensible to anyone else. A submarine became Beshlo, iron fish. The image was perfect. A metal creature swimming beneath the ocean's surface, predatory and hidden. A destroyer became Kalo, shark, fast and deadly. Battleships were Lotso, whale, the largest force on the ocean. The metaphors weren't arbitrary. They reflected natural logic, making memorization effortless for Navajo minds, while creating zero linguistic foothold for Japanese cryptographers. Aircraft required similar creativity. Fighter planes became Dahiti High, hummingbird, small and impossibly maneuvered. Bombers were Jaysho, buzzard, circling high before descending on prey. Dive bombers were Guinea, chicken hawk, dropping suddenly from altitude. Transport planes were Atsa, eagle, carrying cargo across great distances. Each term was debated, refined, tested for clarity under battlefield stress. Chester Nez recalled the process. We couldn't just pick random words. Every term had to make instant sense when you heard it during combat. Your life and your brother's lives depended on perfect understanding in seconds. The alphabet system required even greater sophistication. Military messages needed to spell proper nouns, ship names, place names, officer names, which meant encoding the English alphabet into Navajo words. But simple one-to-one substitution would create frequency patterns vulnerable to analysis. Their solution was elegant. Assign multiple Navajo words to each English letter, allowing random variation that destroyed statistical patterns. The letter A could be Wallachi, ant, Belasana, apple, or Tsineheitl, axe. E, the most common English letter, received 5 alternatives. Code talkers would randomly alternate, ensuring no transmission ever established predictable patterns. The initial vocabulary grew to 201 terms, covering tactics, equipment, geography, and command structure. Officers became war chiefs, squads became clans. America was Nehema, our mother. Months became nature metaphors. January was Yasniltes, crusted snow. Then came the hardest requirement, total memorization. No codebooks could accompany them to combat. Capture would mean torture, interrogation, death, and potentially code compromise. Everything had to exist solely in their minds, accessible instantly under fire. For 8 weeks they drilled relentlessly. Morning sessions testing vocabulary. Afternoon exercises transmitting mock tactical messages. Evening reviews correcting mistakes. They practiced until responses became automatic, until they could encode and decode at conversation speed without hesitation. By July 1942, they were ready. 29 Marines carried in their memories the most sophisticated battlefield communication system in military history, and not a single written record existed outside Camp Elliott's locked vault. The code was alive only in their minds. Unbreakable, because it was inseparable from identity itself. August 7th, 1942. 15 Navajo Code Talkers landed with the 1st Marine Division on Guadalcanal's blood-red beaches. Within hours, Japanese radio operators at Rabaul began intercepting transmissions unlike anything they'd encountered. The initial confusion was immediate. Lieutenant Yamada's first report to Intelligence Command was cautious. Unidentified language in marine communications, not English, possibly indigenous, requires analysis. Within 72 hours, that caution transformed into alarm. These weren't occasional aberrations. They were the primary communication method for entire marine units. The transmissions preceded every American movement: artillery coordinates, troop positions, supply requests, attack timings, all flowing in this impenetrable language with devastating tactical precision. Japanese forces found themselves unable to anticipate attacks that their intelligence doctrine insisted they should see coming. On November 8th, Code Talker Chester Nez transmitted artillery coordinates in 14 seconds. Beshlo at position Tsenil, Wallachi, Dze. Japanese operators recorded every syllable. Their cryptographers analyzed the frequency distribution, the phonetic patterns, the transmission timing. The intelligence was clearly there, embedded in sounds they could hear but not comprehend. Marine shells destroyed the targeted machine gun nest 2 minutes later. Colonel Haruo Konuma's battlefield reports grew increasingly desperate. Enemy communications remain unsolvable, cannot predict movements, cannot intercept supply information. Our tactical advantage is gone. Then came the POW, who should have been their salvation. Joe Kiyumiya, a Navajo soldier captured at Bataan in April 1942, was transported to the Omuna Interrogation Center in September. Japanese intelligence believed they'd found the key, a native speaker who could unlock the mysterious transmissions flooding their receivers. They played him the recordings. Kiyumiya heard his native language, the tones, the glottal stops, the familiar phonetic contours of home. But the sentences made no sense. Beshlo attacks Lotso near Dze position. Iron fish attacks whale near hemlock position. The individual words were recognizable. The military meaning was invisible. When interrogators demanded translations, Kiyumiya could only explain, "I hear Navajo words, but they're not connected properly. I don't understand what they mean together." The interrogators didn't believe him. They assumed resistance training, memorized cover stories, deliberate deception. The torture began methodically. Water torture to force cooperation. Beatings for perceived lies. Hours suspended by his arms until shoulder joints separated. In winter 1943, they forced him naked into snow until frostbite blackened his feet. Between sessions, they'd play more recordings. Same question, same answer. I hear the words. I cannot tell you their military meaning. A May 1943 intelligence assessment captured their growing realization. Prisoner demonstrates native fluency, but cannot decode tactical content. Conclusion: Americans employ specialized military encoding within indigenous language structure. Breaking requires both linguistic knowledge and specific code training. Prisoner possesses only former. The report was filed alongside thousands of hours of recorded transmissions, frequency analyses, and failed decryption attempts. Japanese cryptographers had documented every detail of their failure with methodical precision. By late 1943, after 18 months of effort, and Kiyumiya's continued inability to help, despite brutal interrogation, Japanese intelligence largely abandoned systematic decryption attempts. The transmissions still poured in from Tarawa, Saipan, the Marshall Islands, but they'd become background noise, catalogued and ignored. Joe Kiyumiya survived 3.5 years of captivity, weighing 90 pounds at liberation. His inability to break the code had inadvertently proven its perfection. Even native fluency wasn't enough. The code required training, context, and cultural framework that existed nowhere outside Marine combat units. Japan had captured the one man who should have compromised everything, and learned only that the code was more unbreakable than they'd feared. By 1943, the Code Talkers had evolved from experimental unit to indispensable force. What began with 29 recruits expanded to over 400 Navajo Marines, deployed across every major Pacific operation. They became the backbone of Marine communications, not because of novelty, but because nothing else worked as flawlessly under fire. At Tarawa in November 1943, Code Talkers coordinated the brutal amphibious assault across 76 hours of continuous combat. Artillery coordinates flowed in Navajo, while Japanese forces intercepted every transmission and learned nothing. Marine commanders could speak freely, directing naval gunfire and air support without encryption delays. Operations that would have required 30 minutes using cipher machines happened in 20 seconds. Major Howard Connor, 5th Marine Division signal officer, put it simply: without the Navajo Code Talkers, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima. Saipan in June 1944 demonstrated their tactical versatility. Code Talkers didn't just transmit coordinates, they became forward observers, reconnaissance liaisons, command center hubs. They relayed enemy troop movements, called in naval bombardments, coordinated multi-unit flanking maneuvers, all in real time while under direct fire. The speed was revolutionary. Decisions that once required minutes of encoding now happened at the pace of thought. Japanese intelligence continued recording transmissions. By mid-1944, they'd intercepted over 15,000 Navajo messages. The recordings filled entire archives. None had been decoded. Peleliu in September proved the system's durability under extreme conditions. Code Talkers operated in 115-degree heat during artillery barrages through communication equipment failures. When radios malfunctioned, they switched to field telephones. When lines were cut, they ran messages physically between units, always in Navajo, always encrypted with military terminology no outsider could penetrate. The Japanese changed tactics. Unable to decode the transmissions, they attempted jamming, frequency disruption, deliberate interference. It didn't matter. Code Talkers simply shifted frequencies and continued transmitting. Then came Iwo Jima, February 19th, 1945. 6 Code Talkers landed with the initial assault waves on black volcanic sand under withering Japanese fire. For the next 48 hours, they transmitted over 800 messages without a single error. 800 tactical communications, troop movements, artillery adjustments, casualty reports, supply requests, reinforcement coordinates, all flawless, all instant, all completely secure. The mathematics were staggering. Traditional cipher machines would have required 400 hours to encode and decode the same volume. The Code Talkers did it in 2 days, often while pinned down by mortar fire, sometimes while treating wounded Marines between transmissions. Major Connor's combat report documented the impact. Complete communication security, maintained throughout operation. Enemy demonstrated no ability to anticipate movements or decode tactical intentions. Code Talkers operated continuously under fire with 0 transmission errors. By the time Marines raised the flag on Mount Suribachi, Navajo transmissions had coordinated every phase of the assault. Artillery barrages that pulverized Japanese positions, naval gunfire that destroyed reinforced bunkers, airstrikes that cleared landing zones, medical evacuations that saved hundreds of lives. The Japanese garrison on Iwo Jima fought ferociously, but they fought blind. Every American move was discussed openly over radio and remained completely invisible to enemy intelligence. From Guadalcanal to Okinawa, across 3 years and every major Pacific campaign, the Code Talkers transmitted tens of thousands of messages. Japanese cryptographers recorded, analyzed, and archived them all. Not one was ever broken, not a single sentence decoded, not even after capturing equipment, interrogating prisoners, and applying every cryptanalytic technique developed over decades. The code remained perfect, and the Pacific turned on words spoken in a language that had survived centuries, now weaponized into victory. September 1945. American occupation forces began systematic interrogations of Japanese military intelligence personnel. Among the thousands of debriefings, one line of questioning produced answers that validated what Marine commanders had suspected throughout the Pacific campaign. The Navajo Code had never been compromised, not once. Commander Atsuzo Kurihara, interviewed at the former ADA Communications Unit facility, spoke with the careful precision of a man documenting professional failure. We intercepted Marine transmissions beginning in August 1942. Initial assessment was standard cryptographic challenge. Identify language, establish patterns, decode content. Within weeks, we recognized this was unlike any code we'd encountered. The interrogation transcripts paint a picture of mounting Japanese desperation. Lieutenant Kazuo Yamada's testimony was particularly detailed. We recorded over 20,000 transmissions between 1942 and 1945. Applied frequency analysis, statistical modeling, pattern recognition, every cryptanalytic method available. Consulted linguistics professors from 3 universities. Brought in language specialists who'd studied indigenous Pacific cultures. Nothing produced results. What emerged from these interviews was the scale of resources Japan had devoted to breaking the code. The ADA facility alone assigned 40 full-time cryptographers to the problem. They'd filled 12 rooms with wax cylinder recordings. They'd created elaborate frequency charts, phonetic breakdowns, timing analyses, all of which now sat in files marked unsolved. The most damning admission came from Captain Tsunezo Wachi, former chief of Japanese naval intelligence. The Marine Code represented our greatest cryptanalytic failure of the war. We broke American diplomatic codes, British naval communications, multiple military ciphers. But these transmissions remained completely impenetrable. We never identified the language, never decoded a single message, never even understood the basic structure. American interrogators pressed for specifics. Had they recognized it was a Native American language? We theorized indigenous origin by 1943, Yamada admitted. But which language? There are hundreds. We had no baseline for comparison, no linguistic framework, no speakers to consult. Even after capturing a Navajo prisoner, we learned only that knowing the language wasn't enough. The military encoding required specialized training we couldn't replicate. The interviews revealed something else. Japanese intelligence had known their failure was catastrophic. Internal reports from 1944 showed they'd calculated the tactical cost. Unable to decrypt Marine communications, they'd lost the ability to anticipate American movements, predict landing sites, or intercept logistical information. The intelligence advantage that had shaped the war's first year had completely evaporated. By late 1944, we stopped dedicated decryption efforts, Kurihara testified. We continued recording transmissions for archival purposes, but active cryptanalysis was abandoned. The resources were needed elsewhere. We had failed. Colonel Haruo Konuma's statement was blunter. The Americans deployed a weapon we had no counter for, not superior technology or greater numbers, but a communication system built on cultural knowledge we couldn't access. It was brilliant, and it was unbeatable. The admission was complete. Japan's finest cryptographers, operating sophisticated equipment with virtually unlimited resources, had been defeated by 29 Navajo recruits, and a language evolved over centuries in the American Southwest. The code that should never have existed had become the only unbroken code in modern warfare history, and Japan's own intelligence officers were now confirming what the Code Talkers had proven on every Pacific battlefield. Some fortresses cannot be breached because they're built not from steel or mathematics, but from culture itself. August 1945. The war ended. Marines returned home to ticker tape parades, medals, and national celebration. The Navajo Code Talkers returned to silence. The code remained classified. Not for months, for 23 years. While America celebrated victory, the men who'd made that victory possible couldn't speak about their service. Not to their families, not to their communities, not even to other Navajo veterans who'd fought in different units. The classification was absolute. They'd been sworn to secrecy at Camp Elliott in 1942, and that oath didn't end with Japan's surrender. Chester Nez returned to the reservation in New Mexico, carrying memories of Guadalcanal, Bougainville, and Peleliu, and couldn't share a single story. His family knew he'd been a Marine. They didn't know he'd transmitted hundreds of messages that coordinated artillery strikes, called in air support, saved countless lives. When relatives asked what he'd done in the war, he gave vague answers. Communications work, radio operations. The silence was necessary from a military perspective. The code might be needed again. Korea loomed. Cold War tensions were rising. The Pentagon wanted to preserve the option of deploying Navajo communications in future conflicts. Classification protected that capability. But for the Code Talkers, classification meant invisibility. Carl Gorman came home to find the same discrimination he'd left behind. Jobs were scarce for Native Americans. Housing remained segregated in border towns. Some restaurants still refused to serve Indians. Gorman had helped win the Pacific War and couldn't get hired at a trading post in Gallup. The disconnect was brutal. They'd been trusted with America's most sensitive battlefield communications, relied upon by Marine commanders who knew a single transmission error could cost hundreds of lives. Now they were back in a country that still viewed Native Americans as second-class citizens. Some Code Talkers struggled with what they'd seen. Combat trauma, survivor's guilt, the weight of friends lost on black sand beaches and coral reefs. But veterans' support systems weren't designed for Native Americans. The tribal communities they returned to had no framework for understanding modern warfare's psychological toll. And still, they couldn't speak about what made their service unique. The secrecy created an additional burden. Their fellow Navajo knew these men were veterans, but didn't understand why their service felt different, heavier. Code Talkers carried classified knowledge like a second layer of trauma. Stories that needed telling but couldn't be shared. Years passed. Korea came and went without deploying the code. Vietnam escalated. The Navajo Code Talkers remained sworn to silence, watching their contribution fade into classified archives, while other units received recognition, wrote memoirs, gave interviews. It wasn't until 1968, 26 years after the first 29 recruits created the code, that the Pentagon finally declassified the program. Only then could Chester Nez, Carl Gorman, and the surviving Code Talkers begin telling their stories. By then, many had already died, their service unknown outside classified military files. Heroes who'd helped turn the Pacific War, buried in unmarked graves with their greatest achievement, still secret. The men who'd spoken freely on every battlefield from Guadalcanal to Okinawa had come home to decades of enforced silence. They'd broken Japan's intelligence apparatus, but couldn't break their own government's classification. Victory had come with a price. Invisibility, even in their own history. The recognition, when it finally came, arrived in waves, each one attempting to repay decades of silence. 1968 brought declassification. Suddenly, the code talkers could speak. Newspapers ran stories. Documentaries were filmed. The men who'd returned home in enforced obscurity began receiving invitations to schools, military ceremonies, veteran gatherings. Chester Nez stood before audiences and finally told the story he'd carried for 26 years, how 29 Navajo recruits had created the Unbreakable Code. But public awareness moved slowly. Recognition remained scattered, informal, insufficient for what they'd achieved. The real turning point came in 2001. President George W. Bush awarded congressional gold medals to the original 29 code talkers and silver medals to the 300 who'd followed. The ceremony at the Capitol Rotunda was emotional, overdue, and profound. 4 of the original 29 were still alive to receive their medals in person. Chester Nez, then 80 years old, stood in the same building where Philip Johnston had once convinced skeptical military officials that Navajo could win wars. "We are being honored for using our sacred language to help win World War II," Nez said. "Our language was our weapon. It was the only weapon the enemy could never capture or decode." The recognition sparked something deeper than individual honors. It triggered cultural revival. On the Navajo Nation, the code talkers became symbols of linguistic resilience. For generations, Navajo children had been punished in government boarding schools for speaking their native language. Teachers had beaten students for using Navajo words. The message had been clear: assimilate, forget, abandon your culture. Now, that same language was being celebrated as a strategic weapon, a national treasure, proof that indigenous knowledge held power the modern world desperately needed. Navajo language programs expanded across the reservation. Schools that once punished Navajo speakers now taught the language with pride. Young people who'd grown up speaking primarily English enrolled in immersion courses, reclaiming what previous generations had been forced to suppress. The code talkers became living proof that their language wasn't a relic, it was a fortress. Museums dedicated exhibits to their story. The Pentagon added code talker history to military curricula. Marine Corps boot camps included lessons on how Navajo communications had shaped Pacific strategy. August 14th became National Navajo Code Talkers Day, observed annually with ceremonies across the Southwest. The cultural impact extended beyond Navajo communities. The Code Talkers' story became a teaching moment for America itself. Diversity wasn't just moral principle, it was strategic advantage. The code had worked precisely because of cultural specificity, because of linguistic complexity that evolved outside European frameworks, because 29 Navajo men brought knowledge no amount of technology could replicate. As the last original code talkers passed away, Chester Nez in 2014, among the final survivors, their legacy shifted from living memory to permanent history. Monuments were erected, scholarships established in their names. Their story entered textbooks, not as footnote, but as crucial chapter in how America won the Pacific War. The language Japan couldn't break now thrives in classrooms, ceremonies, and cultural centers. The code that saved countless lives continues saving something equally precious: Navajo identity itself, preserved and strengthened by the men who proved that some weapons are forged not in factories, but in centuries of cultural survival. Commander Kurihara died in 1973, never having decoded a single Navajo transmission. The wax cylinders from the ARDA facility, thousands of hours of recorded mysteries, were eventually destroyed, their contents still unsolved. Japan's most sophisticated cryptographic operation had been defeated not by superior technology, but by something they never anticipated: culture weaponized into communication. The lesson transcends military history. The Navajo Code wasn't unbreakable because of mathematical complexity or mechanical encryption. It was unbreakable because it was alive, carried in the minds of men whose identity was inseparable from the language itself. Every transmission was more than tactical information. It was centuries of cultural evolution, geographic isolation, linguistic adaptation, and survival against suppression, all compressed into seconds of battlefield communication. Japan prepared for machines. They built facilities to crack cipher devices, trained analysts in frequency patterns and statistical modeling, invested in technology designed to defeat technology. What they couldn't prepare for was humanity in its most specific form: a language shaped by high desert landscapes, sheep-herding metaphors, and tonal variations that existed nowhere else on Earth. The Code Talkers proved something profound. America's greatest strategic advantage has never been industrial capacity or technological superiority alone. It's been the ability to draw strength from human diversity, to recognize that different cultures, languages, and perspectives aren't weaknesses to be eliminated, but assets to be leveraged. 29 Navajo recruits accomplished what entire cryptographic departments couldn't. They created perfect security through cultural specificity. Their success wasn't despite being Navajo. It was because they were Navajo, because their language had survived attempted erasure, because their identity remained intact even as government schools tried to strip it away. That same language, once punished and suppressed, transmitted over 800 flawless messages during the most critical 48 hours of the Iwo Jima campaign. The words teachers had beaten out of children's mouths became the words that coordinated victory. There's a deeper truth embedded in their story. Some fortresses can't be built with steel or mathematics. Some weapons can't be forged in factories. The most powerful encryption isn't found in machines. It's found in the irreducible complexity of human culture, in languages that carry millennia of knowledge, in identities that resist simplification. Japan never broke the Navajo Code, because breaking it would have required becoming Navajo, understanding not just vocabulary and grammar, but the cultural logic that made metaphors intuitive, the landscape that shaped linguistic patterns, the history that gave words their power. The Code Talkers' final message echoes across decades. Diversity isn't weakness, it's encryption, it's strategic depth. It's the kind of strength that can't be copied, can't be stolen, can't be broken, because it's built from identity itself. Not all weapons are steel or fire. Some are words shaped by centuries of survival, spoken by men who refused to let their culture die, carried into battle where they became unbreakable. The code was never just about winning a war. It was about proving that preservation of culture, of language, identity, and difference creates power no enemy can defeat. That truth remains unbroken.